For Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise at third reading of Bill C50 to offer some thoughts about the bill and about the issue of electoral reform, whether it's reforming finance or reforming the way we vote, or more generally, Madam Speaker. And I think it's important to try and start off with some reflections on why anyone listening at home might care about this debate, because if you look at the bill, it doesn't do a lot. It does some things. It does add some measure of transparency to political fundraising events that are being held by members of government in the formal sense, so cabinet ministers, the Prime Minister, obviously, of course, party leaders. But in terms of any kind of, I mean, except for the Canadians that are really on the Elections Canada website all the time and are interested to pour through these names, or some of them who will watch political news shows with analysts that are more familiar with the names and with that data and are going to benefit from maybe understanding better some of the relationships around government. And understanding those things is not a bad thing, and it's helpful to have more of that information in the public domain, Madam Speaker. But I think a lot of Canadians are going to feel like, well, this isn't going to make a big difference for me, personally, in terms of the way that I relate to the political system. And for a lot of Canadians, the way they relate to the political system is with a fair bit of cynicism. They feel like whoever they vote for, it doesn't really matter. The issues of the day don't really get addressed. And they're anxious, if they're going to see any kind of reform, it has to be big enough and bold enough to help them feel like their participation, even if that's only going out to vote once every 4 years, is going to start to feel to them like it makes more of a difference than they now feel that it does. And I would say to a lot of Canadians that going out and voting makes more of a difference than they know, and they may not feel that it makes much of a difference, but it can make a lot more of a difference than they know. But I'd also forgive them for not feeling that way, particularly in light of a government that ran on a slogan of real change, but is largely defending the status quo. And you can see that with this bill. This bill isn't really about fundamentally changing the Canadian political system at all. And so to the extent that a lot of Canadians, those who voted and many more who don't ever bother to vote, Madam Speaker, would look at this and say that they feel like our political system isn't working for them, they feel like it's hard for them to have their voice heard, and tinkering around the edges doesn't fix that. So whereas a lot of Canadians voted for a government that promised real change, and not just real change generally or real change on this or that, promised real change specifically about electoral reform. The big promise was that 2015 would be the last election fought on the first past the post system. This bill is really a status quo bill. I mean, it doesn't provide anything near the level of change that was promised in terms of electoral reform. So to the extent that I think all of us in this chamber have a stake in caring about how Canadians feel about the state of their democracy, and to the extent that some real change is required in order to get many Canadians who feel disaffected and disinterested in Canadian politics back at the table, or to the table for the first time, we should be concerned that this bill, which was an opportunity for the Liberal Party and for the government to present its vision for how we were going to bring some meaningful change to Canadian electoral politics, really says, let's keep on with the status quo that we knew many Canadians, around 40% of Canadians most times don't even find is worth showing up for, and many of those who do feel is in some important way broken. That's not a good status quo, and it's not a status quo that the Liberals promised to defend in the last election. They said that they were going to change it. They said that they heard that message and that they were on side with Canadians who felt that way, and a reason to vote for them was because they understood that and they were going to bring meaningful reform. So, publishing the details of a fundraising event 5 days in advance, the lack of that information is not what has been driving Canadians away from the political process progressively more and more over the last 30 or 40 years. It wasn't that they didn't get the 5-day notice on the fundraiser. It wasn't that it didn't apply to the leaders of political parties that aren't currently in government. That's not what Canadians were calling for when they said they wanted meaningful change in order to feel that the political process was working for them. But that's all that's offered in this bill. So fine, a step in the right direction. I don't have a problem supporting it. It's not that it's a bad measure because it's not enough, but it really doesn't meet the expectation that was set in the minds of Canadian voters for improving the electoral system. So where are we 4 years from now, regardless of who's elected to government in the next election? Well, Madam Speaker, we're in the same bloody place we were over 2 years ago, when Canadians were dissatisfied and electoral reform was an election issue. So how is it that we went through a whole election where that was a key election issue and there were key promises made on the part of the now governing party, and we end up in the same place with the same complaints and the same feelings of dissatisfaction? That's the problem with this bill. That's not a reason not to vote for it, but it's a real problem with this bill, and it's a problem for Canadians who were rightly fed up with the status quo. And to some extent, Madam Speaker, this doesn't just defend the status quo, but it actually legitimizes some of the worst aspects of the status quo that the Liberals, I think, have professionalized to an extent that nobody foresaw or expected in terms of cash for access fundraising. So for as much as politicians of all stripes have always done fundraising, and members of the governing party have always done fundraising, it's not until this Parliament, and believe me, Madam Speaker, it's not because we had more charitable opposition parties in former parliaments that cash for access wasn't an issue. It's because there wasn't the same evidence of the professionalization by government of selling access to their ministers. That's why you didn't hear about the term cash for access even under the Harper Conservatives. It wasn't because you had a benevolent opposition Liberal Party that was just willing to let the Conservatives get away with that. Believe you me, Madam Speaker, if they had been doing that, the NDP as the official opposition would have been calling attention to it, and the Liberals as the third party would have been calling attention to it too. And I disagree with my Conservative colleagues on many things, but I'm not going to make up that they were doing something that they weren't doing. Cash for access was not a theme of the Canadian political discourse until these particular Liberals came to power, Madam Speaker, and there's a reason for it. Nobody was as organized as in seeking out members of the Canadian business community or different communities that would have an interest in getting the ear of a minister until this government was elected, and they made a science of it. And they went out and they recruited those people, and they offered them special time in smaller venues at a high price in order to be able to get the ear of those ministers, Madam Speaker. That's wrong. And I don't care what the law says, that's wrong. And to be going through the motions of passing a bill on electoral financing and fundraising and not address that issue, not by making that practice, which is a repugnant practice, more transparent. That's not what we need to do. It's a practice we need to put an end to. So to the extent that we don't see any sign from the government benches that that repugnant practice of selling access to ministers isn't going to end as a result of C50, there are serious problems with C50. So great, step in the right direction. But I mean, you could pass a law that says anytime you meet somebody in the grocery store, you should smile at them. That would make the world a better place. It would make everybody feel good. It would be a step in the right direction, maybe, Madam Speaker, but it wouldn't solve a lot of the real problems that are facing Canadians today. This bill doesn't do that, and it doesn't solve the real problems that Canadians are facing today with respect to how they feel about their own political system. At the very least, it should do that. I mean, we don't expect this bill to fix the problems with pensions in Canada. We don't expect it to fix the problems with health care, but we surely could have expected that it would fix some of the problems that Canadians experience in the way that they relate to their politics. So I'm concerned that the government sees the passage of this bill as legitimizing a practice that is a new practice in Canadian politics in terms of the level of sophistication of going out and selling access to ministers based on interests that donors have in their portfolio area, Madam Speaker. And the government's defense of this practice doesn't hold up at all. What they want to say is, oh, well, this isn't so bad because the Prime Minister, he gets out there, he does town halls, he talks to people, write him a letter, he'll get back to you. And I think it's an offense to the intelligence of Canadians to pretend that the little old lady who comes to a town hall with 3,000 people and has to sit in the back because she got there by handy transit and gets to wave at the Prime Minister is the same as a high-powered corporate executive who pays $1,500 to go to a small dinner in somebody's, condo or residence or whatever else to talk about whatever it is they're going to talk about. This bill doesn't give us any more insight into what's talked about at those events, Madam Speaker, or what's said or not said. To compare those two scenarios and expect Canadians to believe you that these are comparable scenarios is just ridiculous. It's totally ridiculous, and I think it's kind of offensive. It offends me. I think it probably offends a lot of Canadians to say, yeah, like we get it. I get that when I sign up to go to the town hall, says Joe Canadian, that I'm not getting the kind of experience that a high-powered corporate exec is getting when he pays $1,500 to go meet the Prime Minister in a mansion somewhere. Like, I get that that's not the same. But the Liberals are trying to tell you that it is the same thing. And Canadians have to ask themselves whether they want people in government that think they're that stupid, Madam Speaker. I think that's a legitimate question for Canadians to be asking themselves. So that's the issue as I see it, Madam Speaker. We've got a really repugnant practice of cash for access. We've got a little bit of window dressing here to try and make it seem a little bit better, maybe kind of okay. I don't think it accomplishes that at all, but in the absence of real reform, it's not worth turning down. And then I think, man, what a missed opportunity, because the Liberals actually built a mandate for meaningful reform and said that they weren't the status quo party and said that they wanted changes. So instead of talking about, the quality of this window dressing and, or the color of the drapes, we could be talking about what kind of new voting system we're going to have. We could be talking about other measures that would have done a lot for Canadian democracy. Some we have talked about because some have been presented in the form of various private members' bills, and I'm thinking particularly of my colleague from Burnaby, who had a great idea. We've talked a bit about how it is that political parties are already subsidized publicly in two ways. One is that when these high-powered corporate execs buy that $1,500 ticket, Canadian taxpayers actually reimburse them almost half the cost of the ticket. And I think there's something particularly perverse about that, Madam Speaker, that corporate execs with the money in their pocket could pay the $1,500 to climb over ordinary Canadians who also want the ear of government to get special attention, and then actually have those same ordinary Canadians have to pay them back about half the cost of that special access that they're using to steamroll Canadians. You pick the issue, whether it's big pharma and jacking up drug prices, or whether it's energy companies that want to build a pipeline through this community or that community and want the ear of government instead of having to go to communities to get their permission. There's something perverse about the fact that those same people that are the victims of those bad policy decisions are being made to pay for the corporate executives' access to those dinners, Madam Speaker. So there's that way in which Canadians already subsidize political parties. There's another way in that the costs that Canadian political parties incur during an election are rebated in part by taxpayers as well. So we do already have different forms of subsidy. I'm trying not to go off on too much of a tangent. I also think that that's why it's completely legitimate to talk about a per vote subsidy and maybe even look at canceling some of those other subsidies in order to pay that money, because I think allocating those public subsidies that already exist on the basis of the parties that people actually want to support makes far more sense than rewarding certain parties for having donors that have more money to give and then forcing all of taxpayers across the country to rebate those donors simply because they're the ones with more money in the first place. There's something perverse about that too, Madam Speaker, but I'll digress on that point because the point I want to come to comes back to my colleague from Burnaby who made the excellent point that because we're rebating a certain portion of the costs to political parties for what they spend during an election, we could use that as a tool in order to encourage political parties to nominate more female candidates so that we can start to correct the serious gender deficit that we have in the House of Commons, where we have roughly about, I think it's about 26 or 27% women in the House of Commons, even though they make up more than 50% of the Canadian population. That's a great idea. That's the kind of bold thinking that might actually do something to change the status quo of Canadian politics. That would be in keeping with the kinds of promises the Liberals made in the last election when they said that they wouldn't be defenders of the status quo. That's not what we see in this bill. This bill is simply a reimagining and reinstituting of that same status quo, Madam Speaker. But we've heard good ideas about how to really increase the participation of women in Canadian politics, not just to encourage them more. That's good too, and that's something that also needs to happen. But that ignores the fact that there's a lot of systemic barriers in the way of women participating in politics. So it's not just call up your friends, your female friends more and see if you can get them to run. We also have to take more concrete measures. So I think, I was listening to the member for Burnaby earlier this week speaking to this same bill, who was saying Canada has slid down to 65th in the world for participation of women in its House of Commons. Well, that's not a very impressive number. It's certainly not an impressive number for a government that styles itself as a feminist government and that's, says it's very committed to increasing the participation of women in politics. We know that that the Liberal Party has assured its incumbents of being able to run again, and it has a disproportionately small number of women in its caucus. And that means that if they're successful in the next election in re-electing most of their members that are here, that will be a bad day for women, because actually there's not a lot of women proportionately in the Liberal caucus. But there's no real policy ideas coming off of those benches to address those issues in any real way. And what's been unfortunate is that when we have had real ideas come forward, they've been quashed. Well, who quashes ideas like that are new? So whether it's the ideas that came out of an all-party committee on electoral reform that many pundits predicted would not be able to come to a majority opinion on how to proceed with electoral reform, but did, and recommended a referendum on proportional representation. That idea got quashed, even though it took many people across many different political fault lines working together to make it happen. It got quashed. But a great idea on how concretely to take a measure that wouldn't cost Canadian taxpayers any money. In fact, it would save them some money, because the way it was going to work was that rebate that I was talking about for parties that didn't run a slate with gender parity across the country would have their rebate reduced by a proportionate amount. That would actually save Canadian taxpayers money and incentivize political parties to get more women involved in politics at the same time. So, you want to talk about policy innovation and good ideas. That's a good one. A lot of good ideas that would move us in the right direction that we talk about do cost money, and that's money we're spending in many cases, so I don't apologize for that. But this is one that would actually more likely save Canadian taxpayers money and certainly wouldn't cost them any more. We saw it quashed. Well, who would quash those things? Only a party and a government that frankly is satisfied with the status quo, because where this leaves us is largely with the status quo. And we've changed the drapes, Madam Speaker, but the House is the same. We need to do a heck of a lot better if we're going to address the real democratic deficit in Canada. I look forward to passing this bill and then moving on to those real questions.
And comments? Member for Beaches East York.